Our story begins with two large towers standing side by side in AOG Korea, the global gaming company. AOG Korea has chosen real professionals in the online field for their revolutionary work. Scientists were running around the complex, bustling about setting up their computers. A boy appears in front of us dressed in white latex clothes. He smiles, thinking that finally the beta test of the game is happening. Not far from him are large white capsules with various modifications. A girl with turquoise eyes and long hair appears, dressed in a latex suit and holding a small helmet. The girl suddenly turns around, looking away with interest. The system announces that user confirmation recovery has started. The girl and boy put on their helmets, close their eyes, and their consciousness is carried away somewhere far away. A simulation that resembles reality materializes. A large castle appears before us, being stormed by countless warriors. Is this true? Or is it a hoax? The boy looks ahead puzzled, wondering if this is the beginning. He looks down at his body, which is covered in steel armor with a cloak unfurling behind him, and thinks, this is what they call a game. Looking at the countless warriors, he continues to think that it's not at all different from real life. The warriors stand emotionlessly still, all with the same face. Suddenly they charge, spears in their hands. Archers run after them, drawing their bowstrings. One warrior drew his bow menacingly and pointed it at the sky, following his example. All the archers did the same and sent an arrow volley to protect themselves from the approaching enemy soldiers. Blood suddenly spurted out. An arrow grazed the boy's face, and he stared ahead in fright. In the capsule, the boy clenched his teeth from the pain and wondered what was happening. He let out a high-pitched wail, shocked by how much it hurt. The timer shows 6 minutes and 1 second. A scientist looking at the monitor indifferently replies that the game time was 6 minutes and 33 seconds. A contented man in a gray suit appears, hands folded, asking about the subject's level of assimilation. The boy grits his teeth and continues to lie in the capsule, his hands and body bound by restraints. His whole body is shaking. The scientist, turning to the man in the gray suit, replies that it equals 100%. He's sure the subject feels mortal pain. The man in the suit grins with satisfaction and tells them not to relax, saying they should feel the real simulator, which is called hell. The boy in the game was on his knees, holding his head, thinking that this makes no sense. How is this even possible? Suddenly, an armored hand approaches the boy at high speed. A gray-haired man appears, grabs the frightened boy by the scruff of the neck, and shouts, how much longer is he going to behave like this? The old man continues shouting frighteningly, asking why not a single order is heard from the general in such a situation. The boy looks at the old man in fright and asks for orders in a trembling voice. He shouts that everything is correct and order. Looking at the old man in horror, the boy began to cry, saying he should be allowed to leave. He no longer wants to be in this game. For a minute, countless soldiers were walking in a huge stream toward the castle. A man standing behind them, looking at them, said he was so bored. Looking ahead, he furrowed his brows and said he didn't even think about the old friendship with his father. He smiled and added that he was going to lie. He swung his axe with great force and pressed his feet to the ground, his body clad in bronze armor. A strong wind raged around him as that person rushed toward the castle at great speed in the wind current. The warriors, fiercely defending their fortress, looked in horror at the approaching stream of wind. He destroyed several people at once in one fell swoop, and pieces of the fortress flew in different directions. A large axe fell with great force where soldiers were standing. The wall was littered with mountains of corpses. A large axe was stuck in the wall, and the warriors looked at it with puzzled expressions. The heads of the fighters fell down from the wall. A man with a beard and an eye patch was approaching, his right eye glowing with blue energy. This giant swung his big axe and leapt at the crowd of soldiers. The warriors stared ahead in fear, unable to do anything. The boy watched this in fright. The giant said with a wide smile that at last the boy found this day, the general's son. The boy watched the giant in horror, shouting for him to stop, asking what he was even talking about. But the giant was rapidly approaching. That was the beginning of an endless round of rebirths. After 31 restarts, the only thing he could do in this hell was to fight to the end to survive. The guy standing there looked menacingly ahead and said that was his only option. Someone pointed a sword at the boy, and he looked at it with a puzzled expression. There was a girl standing in front of him who calmly said that if the boy struggled, he would experience unbearable pain that couldn't compare to anything he had ever felt before. The girl handed the boy the sword and asked if he still wanted to fight. The boy glared at the girl. He swung the sword that was shining with blue aura, thinking that no matter how many times he fought, he would come back to life. He leapt at the soldiers who were furiously running toward him, surrounded by blue energy. He thought that he would keep fighting until he finished this hellish battle with his own hands. A huge castle appears in front of us, attacked by countless warriors. Even death cannot prevail in a series of endless revivals. We are taken to children who are running away from school, shouting joyfully that winter holidays have begun. The girls were happily talking and laughing among themselves. The boys were making fun of each other. One guy coming out of school stopped, looking at his departing classmates and ordinary students. He looked at them and just kept silent. This boy was wearing a school uniform with a red tie. Looking at the children, he sadly asked why they were so cheerful when they were clearly waiting for the test trap more than for school. The boy took a deep breath and added that since he had an exam next year, the test questions would be much more difficult. The boy yawned and then thought that for him, who had just begun to live this world, he replied that it was terribly boring. The boy was walking through the city when someone suddenly called him on the phone. He answered and asked who it was. The phone answered that it was delivery and asked if the boy was at home now. The boy, looking around nervously, replied that they just put it near the door. A voice came from the phone saying that he should get it personally. The boy, walking down the street, wondered if he had ordered something and then replied that if they could wait a little longer, he would be home soon. The boy, taking the phone away from his ear, saw a delivery guy in front of him. He wondered what he had been doing for the last few days. The boy suddenly noticed that the delivery guy was holding a package with the rose logo on it. At the same time, he ran as fast as he could to the delivery man. The delivery guy, taking the phone away from his ear, looked at the boy with a smile and said that since he was a student, could he look at his student ID? The boy showed the student tickets to the delivery guy at high speed and then took the parcel. The delivery man rushed past him, looking puzzled after the fleeing boy. The delivery guy sighed in disappointment and then said that his son, who is in elementary school, and this one from high school, both go crazy when they see the logo of this game company. The boy ran to his home at high speed. He quickly took off his shoes and ran to his room, loudly slamming the door. The boy took out a knife and began to open the package. He admired the inside of the package, then said what it was. In front of the boy was a small virtual helmet. Next to it was a pair of bracelets. The boy read the instructions for VR equipment. On it was a picture of a man, and it showed how to properly put on bracelets and a helmet. The boy quickly put the bracelets on his hands and then put a virtual helmet on his head. In the instructions, there was a line that after pressing the power button on the right wrist, you need to follow the instructions. The boy pressed a button on his wristband, and then a voice sounded in his earphones. Analysis of the user's biological data, please don't move. The boy looked forward with anticipation, afraid to move. He looked around his room for a few seconds without moving. Then a voice was heard thanking the boy and saying, "Also, Li Xin, congratulations on becoming a VIP beta tester." Suddenly, a beautiful girl with brown hair appeared in front of Li and looked at him with a puzzled expression. Li Yin was startled when he saw her. He waved his hands and shouted, asking who she was. He almost fell down from fright. The girl walked forward, spread her hands, and said that if he was surprised in VR even by this, then she is disappointed. The girl snapped her fingers, and Li watched in awe as the world around him began to change. In the next second, he was standing in front of the girl with space all around, and she snapped her fingers again, and they were on the beach. Li looked at her with a confused and puzzled expression. The girl pointed her hand forward and replied with a smile that she was introducing him to an unforgettable game of Alog. The girl pulled out a card with the rose logo on it, and then added that she almost forgot to hand over the invitation. She smiled and tossed a small bundle of paper to Li. Li was puzzled as he tried to catch the leaf and almost fell. Then he unfolded it and the leaf began to shine. A small glowing model of the city appeared in Li Xin's hands. He looked at her admiringly and then, looking at her, wondered if it was real. As we're transported to dinner, Li is sitting across from his parents and admiring how he's become a private tester for a new game from a major company out of so many candidates. There is a hot tofu soup on the table. Li's father, eating soup, doesn't care whether Li wanted to become a tester or a tennis player long ago. The boy answers with an embarrassed smile on his face. 15 days and 14 nights, and it will be a winter vacation. They will pay for an hour. The father, eating soup indifferently, replies no. Hearing this, the kitchen fell silent, and then Li is startled and says, "What?" But suddenly his father slams the spoon down on the table. Li and his mother watch in fear, and then the father angrily starts shouting that Li, even though he is a third-year high school student, that he went through a psychological training course for a Marine, what he achieved, A game? A private test? He is crazy. Lee reaches out in frustration and whispers, "Mom," but Lee's father suddenly starts shouting that no matter how many times he's told him that studying is hard work, every second counts. Lee glares at his father, and then he gets up from the table and hits his hand on it and starts shouting that he understood if he can't, then he won't go. His father turns angrily to Lee and yells at him that he hasn't finished eating. Where is he going? But at least he knows how important proper nutrition is at his age. Suddenly, Lee's mother grabs her husband by the scruff of the neck and glares at him. Then with a furrowed brow, she shouts at him to stop because Lee said he wouldn't go. Lee trudges out of the kitchen in frustration as his mother glares at her husband. Lee's mother looks after him in frustration. He's so sad and thoughtful that he can't believe he's missing out on his only chance. And then he turns to his parents with a malicious smile and wonders what the hell is going on. Lee smiles and thinks about how he has a plan. We are transported to the city on the street. Lee comes out of the house and shouts that he's gone to the academy. Lee watches the route to AOG Korea on the phone and then wonders what will happen after he leaves the house. We are taken to public transport where Lee is standing among a large number of people. He makes a phone call and tells the teacher that yes, he and his family are going on a 15-day trip. The teacher asks where, and Lee wonders, and then looking at a poster hanging on public transport with mountains painted on it, answers, "In Quebec, Canada." The teacher on the phone says, "Oh my god, they will go to even colder places this winter. This is very strange." The boy is upset and thinks. The poster says that Quebec, Canada is the best place to live, and he wonders what it is anyway. Lewin runs past the turnstile at high speed, then thinks that the problem with the academy is solved. Lewin quickly runs up the stairs and thinks that of course he needs to prepare for the day when his parents call there. Lewin runs up the stairs and thinks about how this is a problem for the future. He climbs higher and higher with a smile and thinks about what's most important to him right now. The Korea towers appear in front of us. The boy slowly steps inside. He is greeted by a large number of televisions with the company's name written on them, and he thinks that this is the place. Lewin had a couple of newspapers in his back. He looked around the building in surprise and wondered if this was saving him from a boring routine. There was a security guard standing next to him, looking thoughtfully at Lewin. Suddenly, a security guard walked up to Lewin and said no matter what happened in this building. Lewin smiled and showed the guard a bracelet. He poked his finger insistently at the bracelet and wondered if it was an invitation from the virtual kingdom. Then he held the wristband up to the test sensor. He went inside, and a building with a huge number of floors and various advertising signs appeared in front of him. Walking further, he saw a huge number of players, some wearing virtual helmets, some already wearing knight armor, even a giant with a hammer. He looked at them all in silence. Two guys in knight armor were walking to his right, smiling and chatting about something. Lewin, looking at it enthusiastically, said that it was so cool. Suddenly, Lewin saw that it was blurry. He looked ahead, and suddenly, the man was gone. Lewin, looking at this, asked what it was just now. Suddenly, a man with an eye patch appeared in front of Lewin, surrounded by strong blue energy. He gave him a startled look and then whispered in a trembling voice, "Is this really a bug?" And the man with the eye patch smiled. Then he swung his huge axe. Lewin flew to the side in fright. He looked back in horror, then asked what it was. The guy in bronze armor was approaching Lewin at high speed. Lewin was desperately trying to run away from him, shouting at him to get behind him. In front of him, Lewin saw a small house made up of pixels and dashed towards it, the huge man chasing after him. The man threw an axe at Lewin, causing a column of dust to roll over. The man with the axe glared at Lewin. Lewin screamed in fright for the man to stop, while the man threw the axe behind his back with all his strength to hit Lewin. There were tears in Lewin's eyes and he shouted out. A girl appeared out of nowhere, holding out her hand and saying, "Stop." Lewin was lying on the ground in fright, and the man with the axe stopped. The girl approached Lewin with a smile and said that it looked intimidating, but it was a low-level opponent. Then she reached out and approached the man with the axe. She wriggled her arm, throwing pinpoint punches at the man, and it suddenly disappeared as Lewin watched in fright. Then Lewin smiled and said that she was a cameraman. The girl didn't say anything, just smiled. Lewin looked at the girl and pointed at his neck with his finger, then asked why her voice was. The girl approached Lewin and interrupted him, asking what was wrong with her voice. Suddenly, the girl began to disappear into space, and instead of her, a gray-haired man in a gray suit appeared. He smiled broadly and asked if his voice was too masculine. The man laughed and held out his hand and replied that he was sorry. He clicked on his wristband and said that it was just a joke, but Lewin's reaction was very funny from the moment he entered. The players behind Lewin were laughing, and he thought resentfully that this was a joke. so he was ashamed. Then he calmly wondered what else was going on. Lewin smiled as he clenched his fists and replied that it was incredibly cool, as expected. The man held out his hand towards Lewin and said that Lewin's user was Lee Hyun-do, the general manager of testing, but it didn't matter. His introduction was late because Lewin was late himself. Lewin anxiously replied that he was sorry, but he thought that. No way, he thought with a sad face. Getting fired for being late was the worst case scenario. Lee Hyun-do raised a finger and smilingly replied that there was no need to apologize. Maybe now they will start their planned excursion. Lewin exhaled calmly. Lee Hyun-do pointed towards the elevator and said that it was their way, time was running out. He thought they should go to the office and make a presentation after the test, but Lewin didn't mind. While getting into the elevator, Lewin replied that of course he was late. Lee Hyun-do replied that it was great, then maybe they would go straight to the test hall. Lewin and Lee Hyun-do were riding in the elevator, having a fun conversation. They were watched on video cameras by a man sitting in a chair. He answered on the phone that yes, he is sure. He trusts only the client. On the man's desk was an inscription, the branch manager. Bernardo kept saying that he asked to go and see, and then the manager turned off the phone. He lit a cigar and then said that now he hopes the product they can sell is properly prepared. The manager picked up the remote control and then, looking at the video camera, pressed the button. As we are transferred back to the elevator, Lee Hyun-do apologizes to his smiling Lewin. Lewin and Lee Hyun-do walk around the complex, and Lewin looks around happily. When they reach the end of the corridor, a touch panel appears in front of them where Lee Hyun-do enters something, then they pass on. The program scans them and then skips them. The manager lights another cigar and says it's just business. Lewin and Lee Hyun-do are standing in the aisle being scanned again. The door in front of them starts to open and they hear the system message that A12 is open. Lewin looks in front of him admiringly, a little embarrassed. A giant room appears in front of him, in the center of which is a huge column that is connected to the capsules. Lewin, standing with Lee Hyun-do, asks this in a puzzled manner. Lee Hyun-do waves and says there's one more thing. He points his hand forward, and Lewin sees a latex white suit. He slowly walks over to it, looking at it carefully, and Lee Hyun-do says that after Lewin changes into a suit, let him go to the main hall. He will come back as soon as he checks the final preparations. Lewin looks ahead in shock and asks what is the real costume. He takes off his clothes and his bag, and then he zips the suit over his hands, and then on the neck. He looks ahead with a smile, already fully dressed in his suit. Then Lewin smilingly says that now he starts waving his arms and says how cool it is. He runs forward through the complex toward the closed door. When he reaches it, the door starts to open on its own after walking inside. Lewin is blinded by the bright light standing in this room. He covers his face with his hand and squints his eyes, then shouts that it's a light. After getting used to it, he slowly starts opening his eyes. But a girl in the same suit appears in front of him holding a helmet. The girl has turquoise eyes and stands motionless, looking around in silence. Suddenly she notices Lewin. Lewin looks at the girl in embarrassment, gradually blushing. He smiles, then shouts that it's like back then. Lewin runs up to the girl and happily informs her that director Lian Zhao and this version of the cameraman is better than last night. The girl indignantly asks, especially what? Lewin sniffs the girl's hair, then says that as they passed on the smell of shampoo, Lee Hayano, who is in another room, laughs and says through the earpiece that it's probably because she just washed her hair, because that's right, Miss Maria. Lewin looks at the girl with a puzzled expression and says that's how it is. Maria indignantly asks what Lewin has heard, so let him wipe that expression off his face. Maria, her brows furrowed and her teeth bared, blushed, and then asked whether Lewin wanted her to punch him in the nose. Lewin jumped to the side and shouted that he was sorry. He jumped back so hard that he fell on something. It was a small capsule that he had fallen into. The capsule lit up, and then the system message was heard that the user confirmation passed and recovery was started. Lewin happily examined the capsule and said, "What is it?" But suddenly, Maria pointed her finger in the direction of the capsule that Lewin had fallen into and indignantly turned to director Lian Zhu and asked what was wrong with this stupid freak. Lewin indignantly looked in Maria's direction and asked bluntly. Director Lehano happily replied through his earpiece that Maria, he was very sorry, but due to problems with their server, they had no choice but to to merge the online and simulation servers. Maria indignantly shouted that she was online. Just don't let them tell her that this freak is an ordinary user. They are completely crazy. Lewin glared in Maria's direction, then asked why she kept calling him a freak. Maria indignantly raised her finger and replied that if the superiors found out that Director Leihian Zhao had put an ordinary user in the training simulator, Director Leihian Zhao awkwardly apologized through his earpiece and said that, however, because of the last incident, they had to do it. Otherwise, the simulator wouldn't work at all. While Maria was discussing something with Director Leihian Zhao, Lewin was pressing buttons on the capsule's tablet. He wondered if they should have started by now. Why would they say something that he didn't understand at all? Maria continued to yell that Director Lehiendo wanted to tell her that she would have to do this to him, but she never would. Suddenly, the smiling Director Lehano shouted that he understood. Then starting today, they will have access to the training simulator. Maria stopped shouting and glared angrily to the side, while Lewin looked in front of him with a puzzled expression. Director Leihian Zhao threw out, saying that how could they cancel everything? Maria gritted her teeth angrily, then picked up the helmet. She looked away and put it on her head, then said that it was an incident even if they didn't think about it. She would make sure that Director Lehano was punished no matter what. Director Lehano smiled, and then replied that he thanked Maria for her generosity. Maria glared at the side and then gave Director Leihian Zhao the middle finger. She put on her helmet completely, and then lay down in the cell. Once inside the cell, it began to close. Director Leihian Zhao said that they would also be dealing with the controls as the game progressed. So let's get ready, dear Lewin. Lewin looked puzzled as he put on his helmet and said okay, and then lay down in the cell. Director Lei Haiyan-ju shouted with a mad smile that he was starting server management. Scientists randomly began to run around the complex, including all the processes. The cameras that Lewin and Maria were in started up. One of the scientists shouted that landscape generation was taking place. The other shouted that it was being checked by the assimilation departments. Lewin, while in the cell, looked up and the inside of the glass of the cell turned red. He looked away in fright and asked why it was so hot. Director Lei Haiyan just smilingly told them not to worry. Soon the energy from the exchange between the program and the body would dissipate. The scientist shouted that the assimilation rate had reached 70%. Lewin closed his eyes as they continued to shout that it reached 80%. Maria was also lying in the cell, and she heard a scream, which is 90%. The scientist shouted that the assimilation rate was 100% and everything was ready. Director Lehian-ju happily shouted for them to start. Scientists looking at the tablets in which the indicators of Lewin and Maria were visible shouted that the countdown was 3, 2, 1. Lewin lay silently in the cell. The same went for Maria. The simulator has been activated. Lewin's consciousness and Maria's consciousness began to shift somewhere. Director Lei Haiyan-ju watched with a smile, telling them to enjoy the adventure and have a good time. A drop of water fell, and Lewin wondered what that sound was, where it came from. This feeling so familiar. He opened his eyes and pondered what he definitely realized was rain. Torrential rain. Clearly, raindrops fell on Lewin's face again and again. He bared his teeth and began to shiver as he realized that the rain was still very cold. He looked in front of him with displeasure and then shouted, shivering from the cold. He was definitely lying in a capsule, so why was he so cold? He looked down at his body, then realized that he was also wearing a suit of armor. He abruptly turned sideways and his large red cloak began to flutter in the wind, and he wondered where the cloak came from. He looked in front of him with a puzzled expression, and then said that since that's the case, this is the place. Lewin looked around with interest, looking at the puddles, and then wondered what exactly. A large castle appears in front of us. A warrior standing on the castle wall pointed to the side and shouted, "General! The enemy troops have reached the plains." Lewin looked in front of him with a puzzled expression, greatly frightened, and then shouted out that the enemy. He wondered if he wasn't in training. Suddenly, an old man clad in armor ran up to Lewin and shouted, "General." Lewin turned around in a puzzled manner. The old man menacingly said that if you just wait any longer, it will create excitement among the soldiers. He asked you to hurry up and give out orders. Lewin frowned and asked, "General, what's the order?" The soldiers standing in the pouring rain looked at Lewin without emotion. Lewin thought that it seemed to be an unusual armor. He smiled and said that it was meant for the commander. Lewin turned around puzzled and then asked what they said was the PLS. Lewin looked around, then added that, however, There was only the sea around the castle looking into the distance. The old man continued to say that the sea, even God would wish that it was only Black Sea waters. Lean looked at the old man with a puzzled expression, then asked what he meant. He looked down in fright and saw an ocean of soldiers. He wondered if it wasn't the sea, and if so, what the old man was talking about. Lean watched in horror as countless soldiers approached the castle. They all looked alike. Soldiers with spears were running to the right in the direction of the castle. Archers ran after them drawing their bowstrings, and then there were thugs with axes. Lean looked at them in fright, then pointed to the side with his finger and shouted, "How could there be so many of them?" The old man angrily shouted for the general to come to his senses, even if the situation seemed hopeless. He asked to quickly give the order and lead them. Lean looked puzzled and ran to the side in fright. He stopped and looked ahead in terror, shouting that he was scared to death. Why was he even yelling at the NPC? He looked around puzzled, and then shouted that there must be a control panel or interface window somewhere. The soldiers with shields were closing in on the castle. They formed a huge line and lined up in front of him. A soldier standing on the gate pointed his finger in the direction of the soldiers and shouted that the enemy had already formed up to attack. The old man looked at him in fright. Then the general shouted angrily. Lean frowned and said, "Hell, I don't have any mana pool for the game. So what should I do?" The old man looked at Lean with a puzzled expression, and then turned to him and shouted that he couldn't just sit back and let the enemy attack first. He shouted for everyone to get into battle formation, and for the archers to get ready. The soldiers on the walls ran to the edge, and the archers drew their bowstrings. The old man shouted menacingly so that everyone would remember that they were fighting to the last breath. The soldiers raised their swords and shouted loudly. Only Lean stood there puzzled and didn't know what to do. The old man opened his mouth wide and shouted too. The archers drew their bowstrings, then they fired a hail of arrows at the enemy. Arrows flew out of the city walls, whizzed upward, and fell on the enemies in countless numbers. A soldier was hit right in the eye by an arrow and he screamed in pain, blood flying everywhere. The warriors tried to cover themselves with their shields, but they were killed one by one. They screamed helplessly as the arrows struck them again and again as they fell dead. The enemy archers also drew their bowstrings. Countless archers were ready to throw arrows towards the castle. A darkness of arrows abruptly flew towards the castle. They mixed together with the sky as if the sky had darkened. Countless arrows fell on the castle, and the old man watched in horror. Seeing this, he shouted loudly for the men to raise their shields. All the warriors standing on the castle walls raised their shields. Arrows whizzed across the knights. The arrows continued to fly further, hitting residential buildings and knights who didn't have time to raise their shields. There were so many arrows that the knights couldn't even save their shields. The enemy knights took advantage of the fact that the knights stopped firing at them and shouted. Then, armed with swords, they rushed to storm the fortress. They were already at the castle gates. A warrior was running up the wooden stairs. Several knights were standing on the ladder preparing to attack, carried by countless warriors. The warrior holding a rope in his hand prepared himself by getting into position, and then he instantly shot forward. They were holding a rope attached to the ladder behind them and quickly tried to jump and climb the tower. With their backs to the ladder, they tried to attach the rope to the edge of the castle. One of the warriors was flying up quickly holding a ladder. He saw something in front of his face and was horrified. From above, huge rocks were thrown down by the knights. A huge boulder, developing speed, was flying down. Then it hit one of the knights directly, breaking the ladder beneath him. The knights who were under the castle gate fled in terror when a large boulder fell down. The old man, looking at the countless soldiers, shouted that they should not be allowed to get up and to stop them. Knights standing on the walls threw stones down. Archers tried to kill everyone who could even climb the stairs. The warriors who tried to climb the stairs began to fall down, and the stairs broke with them. Those who were not killed by the stone were stabbed by the knights from above with spears. A soldier tried to restrain the spear, but in the end could not. He was pierced. Behind him was a comrade who leaned on him and leaped at the knights. The knight watched in dismay as the black armored warrior sliced him in half with great force. The guy lost his helmet and then fell to the ground dead. There were tears in his eyes. Looking at the dead knight, Lean was startled to think that this was definitely just a game. He stood silently, taking no action, and watched the process. If this is not true, then it is definitely very similar to reality. Everything is real or is a hoax. A huge number of knights continued to storm the castle. Lean was startled to think that it was really online. The enemy archer drew his bowstring, and then together with their comrades they released a flying arrow at great speed. The warriors continued to storm the castle, trying in every possible way to climb the stairs. The knights covered with shields, protecting themselves from arrows and enemies who still managed managed to climb the stairs. Lean, looking at the huge number of corpses of his comrades, wondered what game world he was currently in. Suddenly, blood spurted out and an arrow shot at great speed past Lean's eyes. Then it hit the warrior behind him in the neck. Lean sighed in dismay and then touched his eye and saw the blood on his hand. He desperately screamed that he was in so much pain. It was just a game. Why was he feeling pain? The old man noticed that Lean was injured, and Lean thought that he couldn't even tell if the pain was real. The old man shouted loudly what the warriors were doing. They needed to protect the general. The knights rushed towards the general with their shields. They held up their shields in front of Lean as a hail of arrows flew at them. The arrows kept coming closer and closer at a great speed. Looking at them, Lean screamed in fright. The knights raised their shields tightly, and then the arrows flew at them at great speed. Lean held his head while under the cover of the knights. Breathing heavily, he clutched his head and shouted that this whole situation must be a mistake in the system. The knights looked at Lean in puzzlement, and Lean kept saying that he couldn't even find the control window. Suddenly, he was afraid. It dawned on him. He shouted that he was really stuck in this damn place. A knight with red hair appears in front of us. He waved his sword and shouted, "Knights frozen." The enemy archers stopped firing. Let them go back to their positions. The knights immediately ran to the wall, leaving Lean sitting on the floor. Lean was sitting on the floor clutching his head when suddenly a hand quickly started moving towards him. The old man grabbed Lean by the scruff of the neck and shouted, "How much longer are you going to behave like this?" He continued to shout loudly, asking why not a single order was heard from him in such a situation. Lookism gave the old man a hopeless look, then asked for more orders. It dawned on him, and he shouted that everything was correct in order. Looking at the old man, he began to cry and then told them to let him go out. He didn't want to be in this game for another minute. The old man looked at Lewin with a puzzled expression and then started shaking him, shouting, "What the hell is he talking about?" The old man and Lane stayed on the fortress wall. Countless warriors were closing in on the castle. A man was watching it all, and he said he was so bored. He furrowed his brows and said he wouldn't even think about his old friendship with his father. He smiled and said that he was going to see Lewin. Suddenly, he swung his huge axe and kicked off from the ground. The axe, cutting through the air, raced after him. This man hit the air with an axe with great force and began to blow away his own soldiers. He whirled his axe around himself, creating an incredible flow of air. Then, with great force, he threw it forward. The axe, sweeping away everything in its path, rushed towards the fortress. Those trying to defend the fortress looked at the approaching danger with fear, and then the axe hit the fortress with great force. The warriors watched in dismay as the axe, circling around itself, killed one knight after another. Then it thrust with great force into the fortress. In front of the knights, the old man along with Lane watched in awe as a huge axe stuck into the fortress where countless corpses were lying. The knights' heads flew down from the fortress, pushing off from them. A huge man in bronze armor ran up. The knights' heads flew down with great force as a bronze-armored thug approached the fortress, his right eye glittering and his left eye bandaged. The big man snatched up his axe. The knights stared ahead in fear, unable to do anything as a giant in bronze armor was swinging an axe at them from above. Lane shouted in fright that this silhouette he definitely saw it somewhere before. The giant swung at the knights. Suddenly Lewin had an epiphany, and then he said that he definitely remembered this was Blackwin. Blackwin flew into the knights at high speed, killing several of them at once. The knights, looking fearfully at their dead comrades, tried to run away and shouted that they had to run. The old man held out his sword in front of the knights and shouted for everyone to stay where they were. If they retreated, they would be swept away. Blackwin continued to climb up using the knights' heads. He swung at the helpless knights with great force. The knights, along with the old man, watched in fear, unable to do anything about it. Then Blackwin swung his axe in front of him with great force. He smilingly asked if they really thought they would avoid this fate if they prepared against him. Blackwin started hacking at the knights one by one, swinging to the right and then to the left. A huge number of knights soared up, blood spurting out from their bodies. They were instantly chopped into numerous pieces. The old man's head flew down with the other knights' heads. Lewin stared ahead in horror as he looked at the numerous corpses of his comrades. Blackwin slowly walked towards Lewin with an axe on his back, and then asked what Lewin was doing there. Would he just hide behind this meat? Lewin looked at Blackwin in fright, and Blackwin went on to say that Lewin knew his father was weaker than him. Blackwin glared at Lewin, then added that he remembered how passionate he was, which was why he burned it. Blackwin drew his sword from its scabbard. The sword reflected Lewin's terrified face. Blackwin swung his sword and shouted that it was a pitiful sight. Looking at the approaching sword, Lewin wondered if he died like this, could he finally get out of the game. A man with big black hair and a beard, with a blindfold over one of his eyes, looked at the boy and asked why doesn't he take this sword and stand up. Lewin covered himself with his hands. He removed his hands and started looking around. He thought to himself that he wasn't dead. Then his gaze fell on the huge sword stuck in the ground right between Lewin's legs. A man standing next to a huge axe and wearing a blue cloak looked at Lewin. He said it was a shame for him to cut up the weapon child. He kept looking at him and said that at least now he's dead. It's as if he has his father's blood in him. After which, Lewin looked at this knight with obvious bewilderment. He thought to himself, what's wrong with this guy? Then he gritted his teeth and asked who he was as he grabbed that sword. Barely rising to his feet, he gritted his teeth and said that if this man even knew about his father and dared to say such things, then taking this sword. He shouted that if he was the villain in this game, he just needed to kill him. He raised the sword and yelled, "What the hell does someone like you know about my father?" and told him to shut his mouth. Lewin stood in a sword pose. He thought to himself that it was burning anger. He gripped the hilt of his sword even harder and said that's why he wasn't scared for the first time since arriving here. With the many corpses around, this man who completely destroyed their camp with just a few attacks looked like a monster, considering how huge he was. This one-eyed man started to smile as he looked at Lewin, saying that this is how it should be. He also took a stance next to his axe. He smiled and said it's a facial expression that adds flavor. Lewin started shouting, thinking to himself that he was attacking. He shouted that since it had all come to this, he would fight him the way he wanted. The one-eyed man with an axe jumped on top of him. Lewin kept shouting. Suddenly, the hilt of his weapon appeared near his eyes. Looking at his hands that were raised up, he thought to himself that he dropped it. Holding his hands up and looking down, he screamed that he was really that heavy. He looked at the hilts of this weapon. Then it was cut open, and he did not understand what was happening. The one-eyed man told him that he was no better than a fool making a hit, but the director smiled, looked ahead. That's all. He was standing in a huge room with a lot of people sitting at computers, watching the monitor in the center where Lewin was lying down. It showed the time of 06.133 seconds, and one of the men with glasses looking at the monitor said that the game time was 6 minutes 33 seconds. The director continued to smile and asked about the subject's level of assimilation. They looked at the capsule that Lewin was lying in. He was strapped down and dressed in a white suit. He starts twitching, gritting his teeth, and then the bespectacled man turns to the director and says that he is 100% sure that the subject feels deadly pain. After this, the director looked up smiling and said that turning into vegetables is quite enough for today. He turns to his team and tells them to get ready and go right to the manager. He tells them to restart the system immediately, after which he looks at the monitor and tells them not to relax and let them feel the real emotions, what is called hell. Someone asks their son why he's not at the table yet. After that, a plate of delicious soup is placed on the table. Speaking of which, it was made by the beloved Tendon Chigi. There is a lot of food on the table, and a man sitting next to him is looking at a newspaper. Next to her, a mother in a pink apron with brown hair says that really only let out he doesn't say that he will go to the academy without even trying. Then the father, looking at him, says that he is completely crazy, again played with his toys all night. Lewin, who is wearing a blue sweatshirt and carrying a bag, listens to his parents scolding him, telling them not to yell at him before eating, and he doesn't grumble. While Lewin is thinking about how he's finally back in the real world, he puts his hand on the chair and pushes it back, thinking to himself that this is his chair where he is sitting and eating. He puts his face to the food and thinks it's the smell of childhood. He starts to smile and yells that it's actually mom's food. After that, the man next to him looks at Lewin and says that maybe then he will eat it himself, and says that he is very boring. Lewin takes a spoonful along with the soup, looking at the food and thinking to himself, what does it mean that he's actually back to his daily routine? After that, a drop of water drips onto the soup spoon, and Lewin is surprised by it. All the food starts to fill with water. The father and mother, looking at the ceiling, say that they are really being drowned, and what kind of water is this? Lane also looks up and says that's not the case, and the three of them stand there in shock looking at the sky and the rain that has appeared. Lewin keeps looking at the sky that's raining and yells about how it's not true. He wonders if this is an illusion or a dream. After that, he who is in the capsule continues to clench his teeth and tremble. He shouts that this can't be, wearing knight's armor, after which when he comes to, he watches as one of the knights wounded the other with his weapon directly in the chest through the armor. He looks and sees, thinking to himself that it's happening again. Watching the knights in front run fighting against other warriors, he watches the fights and thinks to himself that hell is real. He watches as one of the knights stabs the other as he tries to stab him, as a crowd of people attacks one of them jumping from above, and how one of the dark knights took up his weapon and pierced the chest of one of the other knights wearing brown armor. Lewin, looking at all this, sinks down on the floor, hitting the floor with his fist, thinking that he has been pulled inside again. He calls it all crap after that. He says that this is simply impossible. He can't stand it. Sitting on his knees and hitting the floor with his fists, he hears the sound of arrows flying and then he notices them. One of the soldiers, the general, says what's on top. Lewin turns around looking at those arrows as they are already flying over. He sees a huge number of arrows flying towards him in the sky. After that, one of the knights with long hair and a huge sword runs along the wall. She cuts through a lot of arrows with a single blow, but one of the arrows still hits this knight right in the head, hitting his helmet. After that, this helmet with an arrow flies off, and Lewin notices this knight's face. He sees his huge hair, and he realizes that it was a girl with beautiful long hair and knight's armor. A girl with a huge sword and very long hair approaches Lewin. He is still on his knees looking at it, after which he asks where it came from. He looks at her face and thinks to himself, isn't she the same age as him? He looks at her purple eyes with purple hair. Sitting on his lap, he seriously says what she wants to say. He sees her hands at her sides and thinks to himself no more. Importantly, this monster will come again soon. Remembering the black man with one eye and the axe that killed him, smiling with one of his swings. After that, he gets scared. He goes under while he remembers it. He's standing next to a lot of soldiers in blue and brown uniforms. A man with white hair is standing next to him. Lewin looks up at the sky and shouts that the CEO will hear him. He asks to stop this game immediately, starting to cry in panic, saying that it should happen now. Then the gray-haired knight, whether Ushin is enough, he shouts at him, looking at him that the general should calm down and give orders, and so it only creates excitement among the soldiers. He continues to yank at Lucin as he looks at him in panic, and the latter continues to yell that he is the general, son of that person we are. Gray-haired, the man starts to worry and say that he is his son, because he is the winner of Black Da on the novel. The one looks at him where the gray-hair man says because it's true. After that, while those two were sorting it out, nearby brown uniformed knights raise their weapons. They notice this, and then Lewin starts yelling that he's done talking nonsense. He really thinks that an ordinary high school student can handle that monster alone. He starts jumping and waving his arms, yelling that he's not even their general, he just wants to get out of this shitty game. After which the knights along with the white-haired man stand with their mouths open in shock. Through the crowd, a girl with purple hair runs towards him. She runs right up to him and grabs him by the shoulders with her hands. She looks directly at him as everyone watches, and Lewin looks at her and listens as she tells him that the general does this all seem like a game to him, and then she would dare to tell him something. She lowers her head and says it's not a game, it's real. He looks at her and remembers the one-eyed man attacking from behind as she keeps telling him that in order to survive, he has to fight. He notices him, watches him smile as he gets closer to them, and thinks to himself that he doesn't. Then a lot of soldiers are swept away until they don't understand what's going on. A man cuts a piece of meat with a knife, holding a small piece with a fork. He takes this small piece and takes a bite. It's only a matter of time before they return to New York, boasting that it's all thanks to him, the CEO. He sits at a table loaded with food, eating while watching lane battle and wars on a screen in the background. The manager, a plump white-haired man, raises his wine glass and says there's only one thing left to do. He smiles and remarks that Maria is a cheeky noble girl. The headmaster smiles back, telling him they're currently waiting for Maria to fall asleep. Maria remembers lying in a capsule wearing a white suit next to Lane in another capsule. Lane shakes violently, gritting his teeth. The director explains that the simulation will end when Line loses the will to live. The branch head takes a bite of meat and asks, what if Maria wakes up? Can I manage them simultaneously? The director removes his fork from a piece of meat and responds that if a malfunction occurs, simulation is still possible. He wipes his mouth with a napkin and adds they shouldn't let that small chance ruin the finale. The branch head, cutting meat on his plate while holding a glass, looks at the director with obvious displeasure. He says there's a small probability where worth discussing. He raises his knife, still dripping with meat juice, and mentions catching a glimpse of a high school student sitting scared on the floor, looking at the man with one eye. The branch head declares they can say the probability of the winner is Blackwin. The one-eyed man throws a huge sword toward Lane, who stands frozen in fear. The director says he understands, then gets a call. Lane, staring at the one-eyed man, shouts that he knows the CEO can hear him and that they're watching. He begs to be removed from the game, or at least have his swordsmanship or basic skills improved. The branch head holds up a napkin while listening to Lane. The director, observing this, says the probability the manager is worried about is 0. The one-eyed man swings his axe straight at Lane, who barely manages to grab his sword. The man crushes Lane, breaking the sword into several pieces. Lane screams intensely from inside his capsule. The director smiles and says, "I knew it, right?" The branch head also smiles, glass in hand. The director continues boasting about how important he is. The one-eyed man lifts Lane's head with one hand and drags him forward. The director notes that even if Lane's DNA chain breaks down, the fact that he's a disaster won't change. The one-eyed man throws Lane into the abyss, towards storming soldiers. As Lane falls toward the angry soldiers, he looks at his player and smiles, saying everything was correct and he shouldn't have bothered. The director suggests they finish their meal, smiling as he picks up another piece of meat. The simulator completes 2 sessions. The simulation restarts with Lane standing in high school armor, a sword stuck beside him. He thinks to himself, "What the hell is this? What time is this already?" He looks at the sword, reflecting that he has faced death countless times. A raincoat falls next to him, and he sees himself from the past, beating the floor and screaming. He stands on stairs, thinking that for the first time, fear has completely taken hold of him, nearly making him throw up. He recalls the next time, when he prayed and begged for forgiveness and mercy, pleading for his life. He remembers 3 attempts while the others continue their actions, shouting that it should be him, and questioning why they did this to him. Looking back, he realizes he was completely desperate. Standing in a white space, he remembers his many deaths, and all the terrible, stupid, cowardly things he did, kneeling, running, screaming, begging for mercy, even smiling while choking himself. He screams, thinking how he's been constantly trying so far. The one-eyed man with an axe stands before him. Lane tries to solve the problem repeatedly, dying or killing himself and watching it all from the sidelines. He looks at the one-eyed man, who tells him, "Your father wasn't such a slob. He was much hotter." Lane thinks he can't even escape that black lion. The one-eyed man lifts his axe. Lane remembers how he died time after time, 1, 2, 3, as the one-eyed man cuts through all his past attempts, killing him each time with just one move. Smiling as he cuts Lane into pieces, Lane screams in pain, not understanding what's happening, trying desperately to escape and defend himself. He thinks he's lost count of these pointless attempts, remembering how he screamed and kept dying anyway. The one-eyed man says he's disappointed in Lane, clearly angry. He asks if Lane's father knows he wasn't like that. Lane thinks to himself to shut up and not say another word, wondering what this man even knows. Later, Lane stands alone at night. He remembers Marius standing before him, realizing that to survive he must fight. He lowers his head, pondering that this reality makes him laugh. He remembers sitting with his friends in the computer club, playing, smiling, and laughing while talking to them. Going to the game rooms with friends after school was his reality. He remembered sitting at the same table with his family, eating their meal while talking, thinking that dinner is at the same table, but it wasn't like that at all. He remembers what's happening now. The number of times he's died standing next to his weapon stuck in the ground, and remembering the man with one eye and how he swings. He thinks that it is true that this was all done by the same director. He grabs the sword and starts shouting, running forward. He picks it up somehow, still shouting, then tries to stab the man, but a piece of the sword flies off after he hits him. They get tired in shock and think to themselves, what just happened? The one-eyed man launches an attack with his axe, hitting Leno on the head while he's standing there with a sword. The shocked man begins to breathe heavily. He fell to his knees, holding a piece of his remaining sword. The one-eyed man stands over him and speaks about his father with a very serious face and obvious sadness. He continues to say that his father was much more hot-tempered, looking at how white the sky is. Lewin gets up from his knees and says that it was like that. He smiles and says that now he understands. Gritting his teeth, he tells him to listen. He's not afraid of him anymore. He looks at this one-eyed man and says that it doesn't matter how many times he gouges out his eyes and tears his body apart, he wouldn't run away from it. Covered in blood and smiling, he got up from his knees and says that after so many resurrections, he is confident that he can kill him. As the other looks at him in surprise, Lucian thinks to himself that this is the only thing left in him. After that, he is killed with a single swipe. He thinks to himself that from the moment he became an endless resurrection. After that, standing on the wall making a blow with his axe, it shattered the floor and there's nothing left. Just smoke. After that, everything around sparkled with blue shades. As Lucent stands there, he thinks to himself that there's only one way to survive here, if he's not mistaken. He says out loud, looking ahead, that you need to fight back and put your life on the line. He watches as they give him a sword. Then he takes it, and Maria, who gives it to him, tells him that he will not be able to match it even if he fights back, and she doesn't know how much it will hurt. She hands him this sword, stood beside him, and asks if he will still fight. While Lewin is looking at her, charged with rage and self-confidence, he looks at the hilt of this weapon. Lewin opens his eyes. He looks up and sees a lot of arrows shattering into small pieces in front of him. He sees Maria with her punch. The arrows flying at Lino are broken. Then he looks at her, and she tells him, calling him a general, that he said he was going to fight. She looks at Yen with a serious face and says that she will lead him and protect him. He held his sword as he rose from his knees, thinking to himself why he should pretend to care about this inscription, after which he says, "That's right." He remembers the smiling general and how many deaths he went through in his panic, fears of trying to escape, thinking to himself that he would no longer follow the order and act, so that he doesn't have to wait for someone to help him. Thinking that in the end, he grabs his sword, stands up from his knees, and looking straight ahead with a serious face says that he has no choice but to fight. After which, many soldiers led by a white-haired man shout that the general has given the order. He shouts confidently to the troops to prepare for battle, and a lot of knights dressed in brown armor take their weapons and shields. He starts screaming, mouth open, fighting the enemies who are climbing the wall. Many are hit by arrows, and they defend with shields while enemies attack with their weapons directly on people with shields. The allied troops standing behind the human shields point their weapons in front of them. Many soldiers are injured, falling to the ground, while a huge number of enemies continue to attack them. They are attacked unhindered, killing many of them. Lewin, holding his sword and standing in a stance, is shaking very much. He grits his teeth as he looks at everything that's happening and thinks about how he was fed up with this battlefield, but now he's used to it. He's not going to die. Maria stands next to him and tells him, looking at him, that the general barks the same thing. Still looking at Lane, Lane watches as she stands and stares at him while a lot of enemies are running towards her, and says that he will teach her the basics of hand-to-hand combat. She grabs her huge sword, holding it up, and says first, after which she makes a huge swing, killing many people who run at him. She changes the grip of her sword and continues to attack enemies, killing them one by one, erasing them. Running up to the center of the enemies is her. She keeps hitting, climbing up, and a blue light appears in her eyes. Lewin watches as Maria runs straight into the enemies, killing them one by one. Maria's eyes start to burn blue, and she says that even if he reaches his limit, swing the sword all the way to the end. He thinks to himself, looking at all this, that she is strong. The white-haired man shouts that there is no turning back now, and they must fight with their lives on the line, standing in front of their knights. After which many knights start shouting, raising their weapons to the sky, and they begin to fight with opponents standing wall to wall. Many of them are killed, but at the same time, many opponents are killed by crossing their weapons. Lewin watches this battle, and then one of the enemy knights attacks him from above, and he notices this. Very surprised, he grabs the sword in his hands and blocks the knight's attack. He looks at how he was able to block the attack with his sword and thinks to himself, what did I do? He looks at this knight, who has gritted his teeth, and thinks to himself, gritting his teeth, what is he now and why is he here? He thinks about why he doubts such a situation. After that, Maria hits him with her blade, cutting him. Speaking of which, in 2, he shouldn't hesitate during the battle. Lots of blood splatters everywhere. After this, tradition has died. Lian, who has raised his sword, stands in shock, not understanding what is happening. He stands and looks at this dead knight and thinks to himself that if he wants to survive, he will have to kill, and that's exactly how it is. Looking at the dying knight and the way he looks at him, he starts to cry all over, bleeding. He sees another knight take up his sword and run forward shouting, and Lewin thinks to himself, what if he kills him, after pointing the sword at his opponent? Lewin starts shouting and running towards him, thinking to himself that he'll be killed. He manages to stab the knight with his sword before it reaches him. He thrusts his weapon even harder right into the opponent's body. He gets right up to him, and the knight starts coughing up blood. Lewin hugs him, gritting his teeth and thinking about what he did, chuckling a little. The knight then falls to his death. As the body falls, Lewin thinks to himself that he only killed one person and it was so difficult. He notices that a sword was thrust into his own body while he was killing the knight, and he starts spitting blood too. He pulls that sword out of his chest. After that, Rose starts spitting blood and leans on his sword. Lewin grits his teeth as he looks at his wound and wonders if he can survive. Then Maria raises her sword and says, "The last one." Lewin notices her while watching. He turns around and sees her holding her sword, and then someone hits her and she disappears. He sees Maria's eyes glow blue in a crowd of enemies. He cuts through many of them, taking another sword in 2 hands. Maria says that he should never lose hope and return home, cutting through another opponent while looking directly at Lewin. After that, she starts to scream as she's pierced by many spears, with enemies hanging her on these same spears. Lots of knights stand around, stabbing her. Lewin notices this and gets very scared. Oria raises up her huge sword, jumps into the thick of enemies, cutting many of them. In her second hand, she takes another sword and tells him they're the last ones. Lewin turns his attention to her as he watches her slash through enemies. Edith says, looking at him with a shining blue eye, that he should never give up hope of returning home. Lewin looks at this, breathing heavily, thinking to himself that he's going home. He thinks that this NPC is just a victim created by the headmaster. Lewin then asks her if she knows what home means. He shouts to her, severely wounded, that even she doesn't know the reason why he's fighting and she shouldn't act like she knows everything. After that, Maria looks at him with her own eyes, and looking back, he thinks to himself what kind of look it is, very surprised. Maria tells the general that she is thin. They hit her and she starts screaming. He doesn't see how many spears pierced her, with soldiers standing nearby while others are watching. Lewin is shocked by what he saw, gritting his teeth as he watches Maria die suspended on the spears. He thinks to himself what she meant, after which Lewin picks up her sword and starts screaming, wondering what the hell she was trying to tell him. He raises his sword up and begins to fight off many enemies attacking him. Surrounded, he thinks to himself that he needs to fight. He swings his sword, killing a lot of them, thinking that just like she said, as long as he can swing it, he keeps attacking. He thinks to himself that he will do this until the very end. After that, he's very surprised, and thinks to himself that it was only one person. He looks at all those soldiers who have surrounded him, raising their swords and glaring at him fiercely. He shouts as he picks up his sword, thinking that there shouldn't be too many of them. He thinks to himself that he needs to stab at least one. After that, he runs with his friends directly at the enemies. He drops his sword on the ground, thinking that at least it will be closer to home. He grits his teeth and says, "What the hell?" sinking down under the weight of his weapon. He watches as many soldiers charge at him as he stands crouched on the ground. After that, he is cut into small pieces, surrounded by enemies, and a huge amount of blood splashes everywhere. He breathes heavily as the water drips from his mouth. Then he closes his eyes. He's breathing while the blood is draining all over his mouth, and then he comes to, looking at the floor. He notices that he's still standing on the ground. He turns around, brandishing his weapon, shouting about that trash, and wondering if they really want to die. After that, he strikes one of the soldiers from above, cutting him open, and the blood of this soldier begins to spray in all directions, immediately killing one of them. Lewin runs forward, changing his stance and holding his weapon forward. While the knight sees it, he doesn't understand what's going on. Lewin sticks his sword into 2 opponents, putting them on the floor with their own weapons. Lewin runs forward, killing these 2 opponents and taking their weapons while they bleed to death. Lewin, who has changed his stance, thinks to himself with gritted teeth. All wounded, several swords are stuck in him, and he bleeds out, after which he falls to the ground thinking that he killed them. Lewin strikes with his weapon. A lot of blood sprays after cutting one of the opponent's legs off. Lewin stands there, gritting his teeth and lowering his sword covered in blood. He looks at the opponent that he just killed and thinks to himself about killing a human. He watches as the soldier screams in pain, looking at how he took his leg off. After that, Lewin makes another swing, hitting the opponent's body, spraying blood everywhere. He swings his sword to remove the blood that got on it. After that, he hits one of the opponents who tried to attack him. Cut in half, the opponent is thrown off by the force of the impact, and the helmet falls off his head while he's bleeding out. Lewin thinks about how it feels to just cut through enemies. Lewin takes a deep breath, then stands over the huge number of dead opponents, thinking about how many people he had killed this time. He thinks to himself that he killed 5 or 6 people. He looks at the fact that all his armor is battered, and that during the round his strength and stamina increased. Lewin then thinks to himself that fortunately these stats don't reset after every session. He looks away and thinks that this is of course a good thing, but why doesn't he feel happy? Maria calls out to him, addressing him as General, all battered. He looks at her and thinks to himself that it must be because of her seeing him all bloody and battered. Maria heads straight for him, talking about what she's after. She begins to fall, and behind her back there are many arrows that have stabbed her. She falls to the floor, and before him, thinks to herself that regardless of the outcome, she's sure that the ending is constantly repeated. He stands there in shock, and looks at how Mary's back is full of arrows. He thinks to himself, why is he? He watches Maria cry as she dies, bleeding to death. Lewin turns around, gritting his teeth, and says that as expected, she took away the illusion created in this shoddy place. He thinks to himself why it bothers him so much. 65 Simulation Reboot. A bearded soldier bleeds as he falls to the ground. There are many corpses everywhere with spears stuck in them, and Lewin thinks to himself, what? Counting this, he's 9. Then Lewin stabs his weapon directly into the opponent's body, piercing it. He thinks to himself that he is 10, after which, Lewin looks ahead coldly, and thinks that all this time he thought he was lucky to be able to kill several opponents with his amateur moves. He looks up and notices a lot of soldiers continuing to attack him, running forward using spears and swords. Looking at all this, he thinks, but then he grabs his cloak. The motif of the knight is what he covers himself with. Lifting up his cloak, many spears pierce it, and then blood comes out. They stop to see what has happened, and notice the emblem on this cloak, after which, Lewin looks on as they stab their own ally with swords and spears, bleeding profusely. He smiles and runs away from them, holding his blade which is covered in blood, thinking to himself, now I don't. So far, all the soldiers were very surprised to see Lewin alive. Turning to the side, he cuts them open as they try to get their weapons out of the corpse. He thinks to himself that he is won. The soldiers still pull out a spear from this corpse. Very angry, he grabs it and tries to hit Lewin with it. Lewin notices this and tries to dodge the punch. He can do it, and he looks at the spear very close to his face. He grabs the edge of the spear with his hand, then straining very hard, he snatches it out, holding it forward and bending down, gritting his teeth. Together with this spear he throws over himself, and the soldier holding onto it falls to the ground with him while Lewin gets tired again. Just as Lewin is trying to get up, from behind another knight comes up with a sword. He runs at it with all his strength, and Lewin notices it by turning around. He manages to turn around and hits back, cutting off his leg. The lawyers go into shock, losing their balance and falling but still holding their weapons. Lucian spots 3's opponent, who also runs at him with his blade while he cut off 2's leg, and he manages to stab 3 soldiers with his weapon right in the chest while he screams in pain, bleeding profusely. Lewin takes out his sword from that soldier. It's dripping blood. He's panting, bloodied, and watching as one of the soldiers whose leg he cut off tries to run away, climb, screaming. He picks up his weapon and raises it up. He thinks to himself that he is accurate, after which he plunges his weapon into the opponent's back. A lot of the soldiers who attacked him are standing there in shock and don't understand what is happening. Lewin is breathing heavily, and his hands are shaking as he holds onto his sword. He's bleeding all over and very battered. He thinks to himself that even though it looks like a sieve, then he spits blood, he will lose. He wipes the blood that he spat out from his mouth with one of his hands, thinking to himself that he is not dead yet. Breathing heavily, he looks back and sees a lot of soldiers behind him, thinking that when this is all that's left, the only thing to stand up for. Noticing this, he continues to lean on his weapon, breathing heavily and noticing how everyone is surrounding him. He looks at the huge number of corpses lying on the floor and thinks to himself, what happened to those old men who like to yell? He tries to find it among the many corpses, looking at how they lie, and mostly they were opponents. He thinks to himself, what's up with that hanging red-nosed knight? Lewin thinks about how they all died or betrayed him by running away, after which he gritted his teeth, thinking to himself that even so, he starts saying that it doesn't matter anymore from the very beginning of this battle. He calms down and looks ahead, wondering what it was like to be back home. He says that it was his own battle. Then one of the enemy soldiers comes forward with an axe and a head that had long hair. Lewin notices this, and he looks at him. It was a larger enemy soldier who was standing there smiling, looking at Lewin. He raises a hand with his head and throws it right at him. Lewin sees the head flying towards him. He tries to see who it is, and then he stands there with his sword in his hand and watches as the chapter falls to the floor. She makes fun of him directly, and he notices her face. He stares furiously while the soldiers smile as they watch the show. He looks at Maria's severed head. He begins to give birth, hold on to his blade, and says that he thought he was alone. Then he looks at that dead head and thinks to himself that it was still there also. He lowers his head and grits his teeth, breathing heavily. He tells her what she was thinking. After that, many enemy soldiers, taking spears in their hands and pointing them at Lewin, run straight to him and they pierce it. And then a lot of blood is scattered everywhere. 97 Simulation Reboot.